Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. My guest today is Dr. Martin Schaefer. I will just do a quick introduction to him. He is a former professor of evolutionary biology and animal ecology of the University of Freiburg, Germany, and now is leading a conservation NGO, Fundación Jocotoco, based in Ecuador. Dr. Schaefer, thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
It's my pleasure, Ricardo.
Okay, great. So now you're working on conservationism, and that's what we'll be talking about today, basically. The first question I would pose to you is, how should people take into account genetic diversity when working towards preserving endangered species?
Well, I think it's very important to take into account the genetic diversity. We have seen in quite a few studies that, of course, if species have just very limited areas in which they can persist and survive, this leads to an impoverishment of genetic diversity. And in some of the cases, that has strong long-term consequences of the survival of those species, whereas in a few other cases, we don't see a lot of evidence of these strong limiting negative impacts on the survival of those species. And while that seems a little bit contradictory at first, it is explicable because the loss of genetic diversity is, of course, a random factor, and therefore it is sometimes hard to extrapolate from one study to the other.
Exactly, but we have to try to focus on, particularly on the genetic loci that are adaptive, right? We don't have to look throughout the entire genome, let's say.
That is right. And then what makes it a little bit more complicated is, of course, that there are so many adaptive loci. They can be spread out through the genome, they can interact one with the other, and we still do not very well understand all this network on how different genes influence others. Some of the genes are switched on and off, for example, and there's still very limited knowledge. But what we can do, of course, is that we focus on those gene loci where we know that they most likely have an adaptive function, for example, because they are in the immune system, and then we can look at the genetic diversity of those genes and see whether they are affected or not by, say, a low population size. And I think one of the most exciting results from conservation biology for evolutionary biologists, for example, is that we have quite a number of good study cases where species have come back from precariously low numbers, sometimes even below 10, and still at the moment seem to be thriving at population sizes maybe of a couple of hundreds without very apparent negative impacts. And I think in a way that is a good message of hope, because it means that species can come back even after a severe bottleneck. And I think they provide very good study cases to look into, for example, genetics, into the adaptiveness of different genes, into the gene pool in general. So I think that is all very exciting.
Exactly. And in order to decide which gene loci we should focus on to try to have the best genetic diversity in order for the species to survive in the long run, we also have to take into consideration, for example, how the environment will change, or the predictions to the climatic change in that specific ecosystem or habitat, right? Because that could also create new problems for those species to solve.
Yes, it does, and I think we have very good evidence for the effects of climate change, for example, in all tropical mountain systems, such as the Andes in southern Ecuador, where I work. We have good evidence that species move upslope in their distributional ranges, and that is most likely driven by climate change, by increasing temperatures, and that applies throughout the realm. Plants do that, animals do that, and they do that, of course, in different speeds. Say a bird can fly more rapidly than a tree can move its distributional range. And so on one hand, that is very interesting in itself, and it tells us, for example, good genes to look for, to see and investigate the kind of signature of climate change are those that are temperature sensitive, and some very good research is done on amphibians and reptiles, for example, which of course are ectothermic and therefore very much dependent on external temperatures. But at the same time, it also has implications for ecology, because if species move upslope at a different speed, what we expect is that new interactions will establish, some interactions will be lost because there may be a mismatch on how quickly species move upslope, and that again has a lot of very interesting implications for evolutionary biology, ecology, but also for conservation biology, because quite often we assume that we can protect species through a stationary design of some reserves or national parks, and that works of course well if our species are stationary, but under climate change in many areas what we see is that the species are actually not stationary, and presumably they never were. And so we have to rethink and develop new contexts and concepts, sorry, not context, on how we can enable those movements of species so that they can adapt to climate change, and not only of those species, but of course of all ecosystems, because after all, we humans depend on the ecosystems that surround us, very much so, because they provide us with the water, with the clean air, with the timber that we need. So I think that is all very interesting, and I don't think we have yet fully found the answers, but it's very clear that, for example, what we would like to do is to establish altitudinal corridors, so that means continuous habitat throughout a altitudinal range that provides species just this kind of possibility to move.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in conservation, in trying to conserve species, it's also important to take into account the size of the range they have, because, for example, if they are contained into a very limited area, it may be possible that they can't really flourish because they don't have enough space for them to reproduce properly, or even because, for example, of their sociality, they might not have a good enough space for them to interact with one another, and also because if they can't disperse enough, then that also can contribute to a lower genetic diversity. Right.
Yes, of course, and I think a very good example are those species that are, say, trapped on the top of a mountain or ridge top, and if you're already on the top of the mountain, there's no way where you can go with increasing climate change and increasing temperatures. And there may be, say, higher mountains up in the vicinity, but you can't get there because you would have to go through a valley. And some species may do that because they are more mobile. But we have a lot of evidence that a lot of species won't do that, even those birds say that can fly. We have a good example with the Aurora parakeet in one of our reserves of Fundación Jocotoco in southwestern Ecuador. It's a very mobile species, but it simply doesn't like to fly above the forest. It always flies within the forest, and as soon as you have a valley, this valley can easily convert into an elevational barrier, because the birds do not like to go out of their preferred niche. And so there are quite a few bold initiatives on how to mitigate these kind of impacts when you transfer animals or plants from one location to the other. But of course, whenever you do this, it's also important to then study how these species can adapt, say, to a new microclimate in a different site. And I remember there are some studies about orchids that where we put into different mountains a lot in China. Some flourished, some vanished. So again, I think this is a field that will receive increasing attention over the next few decades, because this is becoming a more pressing problem.
Mm-hmm. And are there some specific areas in the globe that due to their climatic condition render the species that live there and that are adapted to those sorts of environments more vulnerable than other species that live in other environments, that, let's say, throughout the year the weather is more variable, and so, for example, I don't know, perhaps species that live in the tropics, they have a more stable environment throughout the whole year, and so if they are exposed to climatic change, then they would be more vulnerable than the other species, right?
Yes, I think, like you said earlier, one important condition is, of course, if you have already a restricted range, then you become very vulnerable, because a restricted range typically goes along with very limited mobility, so that makes it more difficult to move. So you may be more vulnerable to any changes in your area, and often we find those range restricted species in areas where we believe that they have been relatively stable over the recent history. And then you have a term which doesn't sound very nice. It's called lowland attrition in the tropics, where the tropical lowlands, where you have, which are not adjacent to, say, mountains where the species could move into. There is the fear that a lot of those species in those tropical lowland systems could effectively become extinct under climate change scenarios. And even in many of the temperate areas, I remember models of climate modelers who were those models were applied to the Appalachians in the northeastern US, for example, and a lot of the species were projected to become extinct over the century, simply because the Appalachians were not high enough for the species to move into a certain zone where, again, they would feel more or less adapted or be adapted to those climatic conditions in the future. So I don't think there is such a strong difference, say, between temperate or tropical areas, but I think what there is probably the distinctions whether you have a lot of mountains where you can move into, say, the Andes, for example, and even there it is not easy, because in Ecuador, for example, we have a lot of deforestation going on. So even though perhaps the species have a lot of altitudinal range in which they could potentially move up to, if there isn't any forest left, and this is the case in Western Ecuador, for example, then the species still have nowhere to go.
Exactly. And what about the role of infectious and parasitic agents in conservationism? Because, I mean, with climatic change, it is predicted that global temperatures will rise quite a few degrees in the future. They are already rising, but they will still rise a lot more. So wouldn't you say that specifically the rise of temperature could create conditions that would favor the development and the proliferation of new parasitic agents that most species weren't really exposed to during their evolutionary history, and that could be another factor that could render them even more vulnerable to extinction?
Yes, I think the changes in climatic conditions are very important, and of course what is very important is our globalization, which leads to a lot of species being confronted with, say, new invasive species, which are not new per se, but are coming from somewhere else, and you establish new interactions among species. And we've seen that a lot. Of course, the typical cases are islands where, say, the Galapagos Islands in Ecuador have as many invasive plant species as they have endemic plant species. So you have about 500 species that used to be in the Galapagos Islands, and you have 500 new species. And of course, all of a sudden, you do have new interactions, and that happens as well with pathogens, with viruses. And we have good studies also in the gradient between urban areas and rural areas. As cities spread, we humans tend to come into contact with other pathogens, viruses, say avian malaria types, etc. Viruses that can derive from bats, for example. And we are now confronted with these kind of new interactions. And to be clear, the vast majority of them have no effect at all. But there may be one or two where a new virus spread, or where there is also a new mutant that has been evolving over the past decades, and that all of a sudden can have a strong effect. So if one comes to talk with pathologists, they typically say, well, it's not a question if there will be a new pandemic eventually, but just when.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And that's interesting because that links with another question that I already posed to you when we talked about the adaptive loci, because another sort of adaptive loci that you usually study in conservationism are related to the immune system of that particular species or the individuals, right? So because virus and bacteria and microorganisms in general usually evolve quite rapidly, it would become very difficult even if you have a complete genetic profile in terms of the genes that are related to the immune system of that particular species to predict if they would have enough defensive power, let's say, to fight back against those new genetic mutations, right?
Correct. Because once again, I think we still, even in the immune system, which we understand better than, say, other genetic loci, we still have a fairly basic understanding of how different gene loci interact with each other. So it is a very complex system, and typically our models are not good enough to capture that complexity. And we have a good case, for example, where we studied a very critically endangered bird in Ecuador, the painted bushfinch, which was just restricted to one location, and the population size was very low, say between somehow 30 to maybe 60 individuals were left at a single site, and we expected to see a very strong sign of a genetic bottleneck because we could model through the genetic diversity that the species had been much more common previously, maybe in the low 1,000, 6,000 individuals or so. And we didn't find a lot of evidence for this genetic bottleneck when we looked at neutral DNA. But what we did find was quite a restricted genetic diversity in adaptive loci for the immune system. And that was suggestive of those birds being even now under a selective regime, presumably by a pathogen. But then it becomes very difficult, like finding the needle in the haystack, to identify which pathogens are perhaps responsible for such a selective regime.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and another very particular challenge, and I don't know if this is completely true or not, but if it's not, please correct me, that is, when we have a very highly social species and a species whose individuals establish a lot of cooperative interactions, isn't it true that if we aren't able to preserve a high enough number of those individuals for them to establish their social structure, their evolved social structure, that that species could also go through extinction just because if they can't establish that social structure, then even the individuals by themselves could not survive properly, right?
I think that is in itself a very difficult question. I believe some species have enough social flexibility that they could adapt to, say, living and surviving in smaller groups rather than very large groups. But that also, and that makes it difficult to answer, that also depends, of course, on the environment, on what was selecting for that sociality at the first place. For example, we have a very interesting case in Ecuador of a cooperatively breeding parrot, the Aurora parakeet, which is also endemic to southwestern Ecuador. And parrots typically don't breed socially, but this parrot breeds socially, which means that typically the offspring of previous years is helping the parents to raise the siblings in the next year. And one important point, of course, is to consider if one was counting the parakeets and say there are 1,000 parakeets left, then maybe just 500 of them are reproducing. Thus, from an evolutionary point of view, the true population size is much lower than what you just count. And thus that puts those species in a higher peril and risk than you typically assume when just counting the numbers and not taking into account the social system. In that specific case, we believe that the force selecting for sociality was to learn the availability of fruits on which these parakeets depend, and which is often unpredictable both in space and time. So would those parakeets be able to survive, say, without living in a group? Presumably, yes. But there may be other cases where the sociality is perhaps even deeper encapsulated into the species' evolutionary history, and in those cases, the species may not be very well adapted to survive, say, in singletons or pairs. And so, as we were already alluding to, I think in ecology in general, ecological systems are quite complex. And a little bit like, say, predicting the stock market is complex because there are so many different variables to take into account. And people try to do that, and they're often very quickly falsified, and there is no good model to predict the stock market. And when it comes to predicting ecological outcomes, it is a little bit akin to the stock market. It's hard to predict. There are ecological theories that are tested. Some work well in one system, but don't work well in another system. And that makes it, on one hand, quite challenging, but also quite exciting to be part of this kind of scientific endeavor, because you have a lot of different disciplines that come into account. Ecology, say global climate modeling, evolutionary biology. And so I think this is a fascinating area to work in.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, but so it is a very highly complex factor to take into account, that is the sociality of that species, and what do we need to have in terms of it in order for that particular species to survive in the long run. But anyway, it is still very important to try to take into account the minimum amount, let's say, of sociality that particular species needs in order to survive, right?
Yes, for example, I think good cases are social systems that we do understand a little bit better, say chimpanzees or mountain gorillas, where you say, okay, they're living in a group, there are good reasons to live in a group because that provides more protection against rivaling groups, against predators, and in these cases we would say, well, a single chimpanzee, or if you reduce population size to very low levels so that you don't have really large group size, that would certainly not be sustainable for the population to persist in the long term, because they would probably be wiped out by whatever predators, or they become more susceptible as well even to diseases because they are not nourished and fed as well. So effectively taking into account the social system is important in order to also know how large of a population size one needs to protect. And so that is something that we at Fundación Jocotoco are concerned with, because our model is to protect reserves in Ecuador that allow sustainable populations to thrive for, say, the next 50, 100 years. And then we need to know how much area do we need to protect in order to give enough room for sufficient individuals to survive. And that, of course, depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at, say, frogs, 500 hectare may be enough to protect a viable population, whereas if we look at jaguars who travel, say, 30 kilometers, at least the males do, they have larger home ranges to find different females and mate with them, then of course we need to protect much larger areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. So perhaps the last topic I would like to address with you today is that sometimes good intentions in conservationism can lead to bad results. So, for example, that are certainly examples of species that get much more advertisement, let's say, in terms of trying to convince people to give money to help conserve them or to preserve them. And then when we look at the evidence and at the data, we could allocate much better those same resources to other species that play a much more important role in the ecosystem they are part of.
Yes, I think in conservation in general, we have the tendency for organizations to focus on those large, iconic, very charismatic species, be it the giant panda, the orangutans, the tigers, elephants, and to one extent you could say, well, rightfully so, because these are very important species. Elephants are, say, also ecological engineers. They have a very strong impact on the environment. They can create, say, savannas, etc. But I think, on the other hand, if we look at the whole global biodiversity, these species are, of course, very selective and not fully, representative of that global biodiversity. And there are so many species that are important, that can perhaps fulfill keystone role in providing certain ecological services, say the dispersal of seeds or pollination, or providing food in terms of some figs are very important because they fruit continuously throughout the year. So in certain times when of food scarcity, they become a very important food resource for a lot of different species. And we have not, as a conservation, in the conservation scene, we have not fully taken into account that. So I think we are risking a little bit the peril to go for this charismatic species simply because they produce the most attention in the public, but they don't necessarily and not always are the most important ones, or are those that are best representative of what we really try to preserve in terms of overall biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you think that because we have limited resources, we should try to perhaps create a list of priorities and to try to first canalize them for species that are most important to preserve the biodiversity of the several ecosystems we're dealing with, and then if we still have enough resources, then try to do the same with other species that people prefer, let's say.
Yes, absolutely. I think prioritization is a necessary way forward and approach, simply because funding is always limited. I mean, to be quite blunt, we are competing with, say, funding for, or why should a donor invest in preserving forests instead of saving children, or instead of working towards vaccination of certain diseases. And so it's very important that we as conservationists are accountable for how we spend any funds and what we can achieve and why those funds were spent in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just before we finish this, Dr. Schaefer, would you like perhaps to talk a little bit about the work you're doing at Fundación Jocotoco and what are your main aims and goals?
Yes, what we are doing is to preserve Ecuador's threatened biodiversity, and we focus on those areas that are not covered by the governmental system of protected areas, which is actually quite good at protecting 22% of the land area, so much better than, say, Germany, where I'm coming from, and we're protecting a far lower amount of land. At the same time, Ecuador is so diverse, and has so many species, more species than any other country when it comes to species per area, that this governmental system can't protect them all. So we look at those habitats that are most threatened by deforestation, which is very strong. Say in Western Ecuador, there are just about 2 to 4% of natural forest left. That is much less than we have anywhere in Europe or anywhere in the United States, for example. And those forests are now vital to protect because they are the last refuge for so many species, and almost, I can't say daily, but very often we discover new species, or scientists discover new species of amphibians, of reptiles, of insects, of course, even sometimes of birds still. And those species have now very little habitat left. And what we do is we go to those areas, see whether there is a landowner who's willing to sell. Nobody is ever forced, of course. And then we see whether we can agree on a price. And if we can, we buy land and then we protect it. We provide some employment to local people so that they are park guards, or that they can show perhaps tourists around. So ecotourism provides some income towards the sustainable management of those areas. And so far we have established 12 different reserves that cover about 20,000 hectares. So this is an important contribution towards protecting the biodiversity of Ecuador. And I think it is an important endeavor that we all as mankind should be supportive of, because this is a way that we can, as alluded to earlier, protect those ecosystems that we all depend on. So in a way, it's not just, say, a luxury problem, but it's something that will be important for our generation and for the generations to come.
Okay, great. And where can people follow the work your foundation is doing online?
Well, we have a website, of course, which is simply jocotoco.org. We are also on Instagram and Facebook. And so if you type in, say, Jocotoco, Ecuador, you will always find us. And then there are constant updates and photos of the activities we do. So I would very much like you to join us and see what we are doing, and perhaps even come to visit and support us, and become engaged in our conservation work, because I believe this is very important for all of us.
Okay, so Dr. Schaefer, I wish you great success with your foundation, that you're able to achieve all your goals there in Ecuador. I really loved our conversation. I think it was very informative, and that people will also like it. And thank you a lot for sparing a bit of your time to being here with us today.
Yes, thank you, Ricardo. I also liked our conversation a lot. It was fun talking to you, and thank you for reaching out.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peralga Larson and Lau Guerrero. Thank you very much for all.